Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now this is an AMD FX based gaming PC I paid £132 for on eBay. It was originally built by a company called Novatech who sell computer components and custom systems, and while this one would have been a pretty solid configuration back in the day, the last few years haven't been very kind to it. It's taken a serious pounding and is covered in months worth of dust. Cases are easily replaceable and dust is easy to clean. What can't be helped though are the specs. Can what's inside this sturdy old rig still handle modern gaming? Well, let's find out. The FX 8320 dates back to late 2012, and in pairing with this chip we have an MSI Gaming R9 380. These are combined with 16 gigs of crucial ballistic sport memory clocked at 1600 MHz. These core components sit atop a Gigabyte 970A DS3P ATX motherboard, and the computer is powered by one of Novatech's own 600 watt power station PSUs. I've no experience with these, but it's lasted this long, right? I've more faith in the R9 380 holding its own these days over the FX despite driver support for the card ending last year. I'll have a full video on this GPU in the future, but for now it's stuck with the FX 8320. Now I've always liked AMD's FX chips. I had an FX 6300 for a while which did alright by me, and it ran all of my favourite games just fine. But these CPUs, I'm assuming, and this is coming from me writing the script before benchmarking anything, that even this 8000 series CPU won't do that great these days. After spending a while cleaning up the system and spending even longer dislodging the processor from the paste-encrusted heatsink, I confirmed that the PSU was working fine, near silently in fact, and then slapped everything onto my open-air test bench, where I then tried my best to ignore the incredibly loud stock cooler. It does an alright job, as you'll see by the temperatures later on, though I'm not surprised. If it produced this much noise and still didn't manage to keep the chip cool, I'd be very concerned. Okay, so for the first game we have Call of Duty Warzone. I've added this back to the benchmark roster because it's a game I haven't played in a while yet. I did quite enjoy it when I had it installed. Yeah, Call of Duty Warzone runs pretty well, not quite 60 FPS on average, but the average overall is okay. This is the lowest in-game settings with the SMAA 1X anti-aliasing solution enabled, because otherwise the jagged edges do look pretty horrible. To be honest, the FX 8320 and the R9 380 are working pretty well together. The FX is staying pretty cool and the R9 isn't really getting that hot either. In competitive situations like this, the higher the frame rate the better, but for the most part this is an okay or more of an acceptable experience. Now in Cyberpunk 2077 it's a similar sort of scenario that you would expect with most of these sort of lower end or older CPUs, and that is outside of busy areas like Night City. The game performs generally quite well. You might even see upwards of 50-60 FPS, but as soon as you get to those busier areas like I'm about to enter now, you'll see the frame rate dip to sort of 30-40 frames per second. You can see the FX 8320 CPU usage is really quite high, and so is the R9 380, to be honest. The card has 4 gigs of GDDR5 and it's okay in 2022, but as I said before, it has reached legacy status, and the last driver update was in June, I think, May or June of 2021. But yeah, both the CPU and GPU are sort of equally limited here, but we'll be seeing what the R9 can do in another video because it might have a little more to give with a more powerful processor. And the same could be said with the FX and a more powerful GPU, so perhaps we'll test that too. I've made a right mess of my game save in Elden Ring. I've literally got everyone chasing after me here. I don't know what's happened. I think I started on this one bloke once and now he won't leave me alone. So it is what it is. Now Elden Ring will run at 30 FPS plus with the low settings at 1080p. I do however have anti-aliasing turned up to high because otherwise things look pretty messy. There are a lot of jagged edges here and there. As you can see by the CPU and GPU usage, it doesn't appear that either component is maxing out, so to speak, but I do believe that the FX is still the limiting factor. I think the older architecture of this chip in combination with this game is what's causing these lower frame rates. I could be wrong, and we'll find out when I test the R9 again in another video, but something similar happened with the i7-950 we tested the other day. I think it was the older architecture that was causing a problem with the game, but to be honest, it's sort of playable. If you enabled a 30 FPS cap, it would feel a little bit smoother because those dips and drops wouldn't be as noticeable. But it's okay. It's not as good as the other results we've seen so far. Well, it's probably a little better than Cyberpunk, but Warzone is probably the smoothest game we've tried up until this point on this hardware. That said, Far Cry 6 also did pretty well. It ran okay with this hardware combination. With the low preset, the Ultra HD textures were of course turned off. I think it would have melted the GPU if I turned them on. That's if I could have even turned them on in the first place. As you can see, the R9 380 is maxing out at 99-100% a lot of the time. We're getting close to that VRAM limit as well. And the chip seems to be more sort of relaxed in this scenario. I think the FX certainly has a little more to give. That's especially true, I would say, if we were to overclock it a little bit. So perhaps that's something I'll try as well in another video. But Far Cry 6, yeah, it's running fairly smoothly here, and it's certainly a playable experience with this setup. Okay, so for Fortnite, I went with the medium preset at 1080p. Now in Fortnite, the game will vary performance-wise depending on where you are on the map. What I did notice though, that no matter where we were, there was quite a bit of stutter. The 1 and 0.1% lows, I think, reflect this. It is playable to an extent, but if you're in a situation whereby some enemies are closing in and they're running at a solid 60 FPS, well, in all likelihood, it's going to be you that gets wiped out first. Though, having said that, I did manage to kill a few enemies here, no problems, despite the occasional and unwanted dips in the gameplay. I'm running around the Tilted Towers area here. This is probably one of the worst affected areas in terms of frame rate dips, because when you're out in the middle of nowhere, it's not going to be as severe. But there we go. Fortnite on this system, yes, it's playable. Would I necessarily recommend it? Probably not, especially in a competitive environment, but it can be done. So let's move on to the next title. The next and final title is in fact Forza Horizon 5. Now you may remember when we tested the i7-950 in the last video, we had a few problems with the streaming. We got a little warning saying there was a problem streaming the assets, something like that. I believe it's CPU related. That was what I wanted to check out here. Would we get the same problem with Forza Horizon and the FX 8320 chip? Because outside of these graphical glitches, well, the gameplay experience itself was relatively smooth, with a few dips and drops as you would expect here and there. Of course, when I went over the brow of this hill, we did notice the same missing textures, which seemed to be less significant with the FX, and after a while, just like with the i7, these textures sort of popped in and everything turned out fine. And it continued to run fine for the remainder of this race. Overall then, the FX 8320 and R9 380 combo is an okay one in 2022, despite the lack of support now for the R9 graphics card. I have noticed that it can start, and it has started every game that I've thrown at it, thanks to its DX12 support. The FX, on the other hand, has probably aged a little worse. When it comes to those titles like Cyberpunk, you're going to notice some horrendous 1 and 0.1% lows. That goes for Fortnite as well, and quite a few other titles. I think we may test the FX separately too in another video, perhaps overclock it a little bit to see what it can really do with a 2080 Super, and we'll also give the R9 380 a chance to show off in another one as well, because I think it will have a little more to give. Both of these components are held back by their respective pairing, so to speak. As for this one then, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, leave a like, leave a dislike if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see all of you in the next one.